Well, welcome everyone. My name's Philip Murphy. I'm director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, and this event today is organized by ourselves in the School of Advanced Study, and by my friend and colleague David Wardrop, who's chair of the Westminster branch of the United Nations Association, which is co-sponsoring this event. And we're very grateful to David for all his efforts in putting this program together, and also to my two colleagues from the Institute, Susan Williams and Mandy Banton, and also to Gemma Dormer, who is coordinating this event from the School of Advanced Study. We're particularly delighted to have such an eminent group of people on the panel discussing this topic. People who will be known to you already: Sir Ronald Sanders, Gabrielle Swaby, the Reverend Guy Hewitt. David will introduce them properly in a few minutes. And what we're focusing on today is the issue of climate change and the Commonwealth. As you all know, many Commonwealth states, particularly small island developing states, are extremely vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And the issue of climate change has gradually been rising up the agenda of Commonwealth discussions in recent years, recent decades. But the big question remains: what collectively can the Commonwealth do about it? How can it focus its collective strength to actually make a difference on this issue? And one of the things that we'll be thinking about in this online event will be whether it can make an important intervention in the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, which is taking place in Glasgow in November. We'll discuss this and many other issues, but let me just hand over to David to make some proper introductions. David, thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. It's we in the Westminster United Nations Association, we're delighted to be co-organizing an event with the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. This is our 5th together in the last 10 years. So it's lovely to be working again with you, Philip. Now, links between the United Nations and the Commonwealth have always been strong. The UN has 193 member states, of which 54 are in the Commonwealth, with a collective population of 2.5 billion spanning all 5 continents. And input from Commonwealth members at the time of the creation of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945 is well documented. Everyone was there to discuss the United Nations Charter, a working document, but it wasn't one to excite the peoples of the world. It was the Commonwealth members there, the Commonwealth delegates, who conceived the Charter's iconic preamble, only about 200 words, starting with, "We the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind." This inspired contribution made the UN Charter more readily understandable and meaningful to millions of ordinary people. It was 1945. Some claim this to be the greatest text in modern diplomacy. But those 54 countries all have their unique agendas, many overlapping. Some are islands, and we will hear the term Small Island Developing States, SIDS. Some are landlocked, that's a rather long acronym, and some are least developed countries, LDC. Successful programs can elevate a country from being an LDC, which is good, but this can present it with new bureaucratic hurdles to overcome for funding. That's where new strategies are needed. Well, that's enough from me. It's a coincidence that our 3 speakers identify with small islands in the Caribbean. All will develop their own arguments, but it is significant that all of them identify, in my mind, with justice. Climate justice is often mentioned, but climate change is more than purely environmental or physical in nature. It involves concepts as equality, human rights, collective rights, and the historical responsibilities for climate change. Yes, it's ethics. Yes, it's politics. So let's start. So Ronald Sanders joins us from Washington, DC, currently the ambassador of Antigua and Barbuda to the US and Canada and the Organization of American States. He served twice here in London as Antigua's High Commissioner. He was a member of the Eminent Persons Group that produced a seminal report entitled A Commonwealth for the People, Commonwealth of the People, Time for Urgent Reform, which we might refer to later, setting out a plan of action to make the Commonwealth more effective and relevant. He is also a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies here in London. So Ronald, welcome to join us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David, for that very inspiring introduction. I think you've managed in a couple of minutes to encapsulate the meaning of the Commonwealth in relation to the rest of the world. Now, I have to confess to being a little intimidated by this very impressive crowd that I'm asked to speak to today at the invitation of Philip Murphy and the Institute. But it is a pleasure to do so. This is a most important topic. Now, it would be nothing new for the Commonwealth to engage in climate change and its harmful effects globally, and more particularly on small states. But circumstances have worsened to such an extent that a robust and joint Commonwealth position is now again necessary and urgent. The Commonwealth first addressed the idea of climate change and sea level rise 34 years ago in 1987 at a Heads of Governments conference in Vancouver. The matter was not formally on the agenda, but in a discussion of a report from the World Commission on Environment and Development, the then president of the Maldives, Abdul Gayoom, spoke of the vulnerability of his own country. He warned that with most of the land less than 2 meters above the sea, the future of his country and others with similar topography could be threatened by global warming and sea level rise. A further intervention by the then president of Bangladesh, Mohammed Irshad, on the devastating effects of flooding led to a discussion by Commonwealth leaders and then a decision to commission an examination of the issues. An expert group is established, led by Dr. Martin Holgate, and its report, Climate Change, Meeting the Challenge, was published in 1989. The report was prominent on the agenda of the following CHOGM in 1989 in Kuala Lumpur, resulting in what became known as the Langkawi Declaration. Now, that declaration was both a breakthrough and a disappointment. For while heads of governments recognized that their shared environment binds all countries to a common future and committed to a program of action, the developed Commonwealth countries did not commit to do anything more than to support the Holgate report's findings and to support low-lying and island countries in their efforts to protect themselves from the effects of sea level rise. The wealthier Commonwealth countries made no commitment to the Holgate recommendations to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and bring their own concentration to stability. And little meaningful attention was paid to the observation that adaptation was not possible, especially for the poor, and it will become progressively more difficult with large climatic changes. So, while the Langkawi Declaration was a good start to Commonwealth action on the adverse effects of climate change, there was also a marker laid down that suggested wealthier countries regarded the issue as one primarily about small islands and low-lying developing countries. That pattern continued as a divide between rich and poor countries right up to the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris in 2015. Of course, today, 32 years later, after the Holgate Report and the Commonwealth Langkawi Declaration, no country is immune from the effects of climate change. For example, southern and eastern Australia's water supply reliability is expected to decline because of reduced rainfall and increased evaporation, affecting irrigation, domestic and industrial water use, and environmental flows. Heat waves, storms, and floods, all of which we saw last year, are also likely to have a direct impact on the health of Australians, and there is evidence of those occurrences. Canada is already experiencing effects of heat-related illnesses in the dense metropolitan areas of Quebec and Ontario. Scientists have warned that increasing frequency of forest fires, storm surges, coastal erosion, landslides, snowstorms, hail, droughts, and floods could have devastating impacts on the critical infrastructure of British Columbia and Alberta. In Britain, where most of you live, the latest report of the UK Health Alliance on climate change shows that approximately 1.8 million people in the United Kingdom are living in areas at significant risk of flooding, a number which could increase to 2.6 million by 2050. And just under 12 million people in the United Kingdom are also dangerously vulnerable to future summer heat waves, particularly the elderly or people with pre-existing health conditions such as diabetes or heart disease. Now, I've drawn attention to these events to point out that climate change and sea level rise is not an us and them issue in the Commonwealth anymore, even if it was once perceived in those terms. Indeed, globally, the problem is shared by all, and the future of all is now imperiled. As an example, in the United States, a national climate assessment mandated by the US Congress identifies costs to the United States economy of the projected climate impacts. $141 billion from heat-related deaths, $118 billion from sea level rise, and $32 billion from infrastructure damage by the end of the century, among many others. These figures will steadily rise, reducing the size of the US economy and adversely affecting the lives of the US population. So, as we look to the possible June Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and I say possible because I'm not sure that that is a certainty in the present conditions. But as we look to that possibility of a meeting in June and what it might do on this vital issue that now spares neither the rich nor the poor in the Commonwealth, it is useful to bear in mind a significant point made by the Holgate Expert Group in 1989. They said this: while the Commonwealth, even taken as a whole, was not a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, its institutions, both technical and political, were sufficiently strong to guide the world by its example. Whether or not the Commonwealth institutions are still sufficiently strong to guide the world by example is not at all now clear. And what is for sure is that while in 1989, the Commonwealth countries taken as a whole were not large contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, they certainly are now. But what the Commonwealth will do in June boils down to political will by the Commonwealth leadership. 10 countries in the world are the top greenhouse gas emitters, accounting for over 2/3 of global emissions. Those countries are China, the United States, the European Union, including Britain, India, Russia, Japan, Brazil, Indonesia, Iran, and Canada. China, the European Union, and the United States contribute 41.5% of total global emissions, while the bottom 100 countries account for only 3.6%. Significantly, 2 Commonwealth countries, India and Canada, are amongst the top 10 emitters, and at least 3 others, Britain, Australia, and South Africa, are among the top 15. At the bottom of this list globally are 58 small states. The United Nations Development Programme has emphasized that these 58 countries contribute less than 1% to the world's greenhouse gas emissions. I'll repeat that figure. 58 countries, small states, contribute less than 1% to the world's greenhouse gas emissions. But alarmingly, those same countries are among the first to experience the worst and most devastating impacts of climate change, with greater risks to their economies, their livelihoods, and to their food security. Now, of those 58 small and vulnerable states, 31 are Commonwealth countries, 31. This would suggest that the Commonwealth should play a leading role as an entry point to the world in advancing practical programs and projects backed up by not only pledges, but by actual delivery of the funds urgently needed to tackle the issues that threaten small islands with extinction and low-lying countries with devastation. The problem is worse now because of the adverse impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on small economies, particularly those highly dependent on tourism. I will speak in this section only about the Caribbean, which I know best, but I'm sure that what I will describe here is reflected equally amongst the Pacific Islands. The tourism industry, on which many countries depend, has been wrecked. Consequently, economies have experienced shrinkage of up to 30%. Unemployment has risen to over 50% in some cases. Poverty has expanded everywhere, and revenues have declined precipitously, forcing every Caribbean state to increase debt for which they had to incur extremely high rates of interest. And while many Caribbean countries have paid for quantities of vaccines under the COVAX facility established by the World Health Organization, orders have not yet been supplied in many cases, and full supply appears unlikely to meet urgent demand. Negotiations with vaccine producers are difficult because supply is limited and prices are high. A few countries, including Canada, Britain, the United States, and wealthier ones in the European Union, have purchased more than 60% of all the available vaccines. Lives cannot be separated from livelihoods. Many Caribbean countries are in danger of collapsing from a massive economic sclerosis. If these conditions are not addressed soon, many Caribbean countries face a crumbling of their security systems, which drug traffickers, money launderers, people traffickers, and organized crime will take advantage to the detriment of Caribbean countries. Inevitably, there will also be a surge of refugees. Post-COVID, many Caribbean countries will have much reduced economies, high debt, diminished revenues, and little capacity to recover. Indeed, the United Nations has already said that Caribbean countries face what they call a lost decade, with economies and per capita income declining to 2010 levels. Those countries will need access to low-cost financing and grants from both international financial institutions and donor governments. To achieve this, the current rules that disqualify middle and high-income Caribbean economies from access to concessionary funding must be altered to include their profound vulnerabilities as part of their criteria. Additionally, debt has to be forgiven and repayments deferred on easier terms. If these initiatives are not taken, Caribbean economies will be impoverished for decades, with little prospect of regaining their 2019 levels. They will be caught in a poverty trap from which they would not emerge for a generation. And then, only if they experience no disasters, such as hurricanes, prolonged droughts, or flooding, all of which have a high probability of occurring. Climate change and sea level rise hangs like a sword of Damocles above the heads of small island states of the Caribbean and in the Pacific. Already in the Caribbean, devastation by hurricanes have led to increased risk insurance, both for countries and individuals. Last year, Caribbean countries were in the ignominious position in which, because of reduced income and high demands for dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, their country insurance risk was paid by Canada. Businesses that had already endured high insurance costs from hurricane claims simply closed their doors, never to reopen. From all this, it should be obvious that post-COVID, Caribbean countries will not have the financial resources to invest in adaptation and mitigation. And should any of them experience a major hurricane, rebuilding will be an extreme challenge. Scholars and economists in the Caribbean are arguing that it is not fair that poor, tiny Caribbean islands are bearing the heavier burden of climate change. They say that menacing Category 5 hurricanes are wreaking havoc on more islands than ever before. And they ask this question: why should Caribbean people lose homes, roofs, and families because someone else is playing dirty? They're calling for environmental justice, a point that David made in his introduction, saying we need to ensure that those who destroy the planet most must bear the consequences most. This development should not escape anyone's notice. People are now becoming energized and radicalized over this issue. They are no longer silent spectators at their own funeral arrangements. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has pointed out that carbon dioxide levels are at record highs. Fires, floods, and other extreme weather events are getting worse in every region. He stresses that if we don't change course, we could face a catastrophic temperature rise of more than 3 degrees this century. By then, many islands of the Pacific would have drowned, and their people fled in refuge. In the Caribbean, smaller islands will also drown, and larger islands will suffer significant loss of coastal lands on which their major productive activities such as tourism and agriculture, are centered. I flag up another point for attention, that even though these realities are staring in the face of global governance, no intergovernmental attention is being paid to the question of climate refugees. Where do climate refugees go? In what conditions? And with what rights? Against the background of what has been set out here, it should be clear that, as the UN Secretary General has said, COP26 in Glasgow will be a make it or break it occasion. So at the June Commonwealth Heads meeting, small states must raise their voices. Their lives and their livelihoods depend on it. They should insist that the Commonwealth, led by its member states who are among the greatest greenhouse gas emitters, India, Canada, Britain, Australia, and South Africa, take on the role as climate champions at the COP26 meeting in Glasgow. This is no longer an us and them game. And while small states are the most vulnerable and face the greatest suffering, no Commonwealth country is immune. And none should be allowed to kick the can down the road to future generations who will inherit a legacy of disaster. The government of the United Kingdom has a key role to play as co-host of the Glasgow meeting. Those who are planning the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting should now be canvassing big ideas and big ambitions, including designating champions against the adverse effects of climate change. The obvious champions, in my view, would be Britain, Canada, and India, each of which are influential G20 countries, and two of which are members of the G7 that is also meeting in June. Those champions should be vocal in Glasgow in advocating for three principal things: drastically reducing and ultimately eliminating the cause of climate change, while ensuring that greenhouse emission reduction efforts are pursued to limit the global average temperature to the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase above pre-industrial levels. That be signaled here. I think that is already in jeopardy. The second thing that they might do is to advocate for increasing the funds and easing the conditions and procedures for delivering money for adaptation and resilience. Money might be in the fund. Accessing it is hugely problematic. Developed countries also must keep their pledge of channeling $100 billion annually to the global south. They've already missed the deadline of 2020. These are minimal requirements. The 2015 Paris Agreement was an important achievement on paper, but the commitments made are inadequate and they are not being met. The withdrawal of the United States from the Paris Agreement set back the world, not only by its absence, but also by the reticence of other countries, which its withdrawal encouraged. With the US rejoining the agreement, the opportunity arises for Commonwealth champions to recruit the US government to its cause. There was a time when it was said with some truth that while the Commonwealth cannot negotiate for the world, it can help the world to negotiate. We are now at that time again. A time when the Commonwealth should give itself greater relevance and meaning by helping the world to negotiate on this issue. Thank you very much.
Sir Ronald, thank you very much. You've given us so much to think about. Talking about champions, I'm so embarrassed that it's only so recently I discovered that the Commonwealth now has its special envoy on climate change. And I'm sure, living in Washington as you are, the impact of John Kerry's return to the climate change field will be very interesting to hear your observations. Meanwhile, Thank you so much. We turn now to our second speaker, Guy Hewitt, an ordained Anglican, so the Reverend Guy Hewitt. Welcome to our meeting. Reverend Hewitt served as High Commissioner for Barbados in London and is very well known here, being the key person, the whistleblower, so to speak, for the Windrush scandal. He has been a strong advocate for the Commonwealth and small island developing states, SIDS, in pushing the Organization for Economic and Cooperation and Development to allow Caribbean and other small states to access development financing when, as Sir Ronald has been describing, Caribbean islands have been devastated by catastrophic storm systems. Guy Hewitt is also a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies here in London. Guy Hewitt.
Thank you. Thank you to our hosts, to my distinguished co-panelists, and to all of those who are joining us this afternoon. I'm delighted to participate in this panel because as a former Commonwealth Secretariat staffer and governor, as a RCS member, and as I said, a fellow with the Institute, I believe in the Commonwealth, as I know many of you all, all of you are participating do. But that really puts us in a minority because the reality is the Commonwealth brand is no longer as well known or as appreciated as it should amongst the members of our member states. And we, as we start to gather and focus on CHOGM in June, possibly whether it's going to be in person in Kigali or not, and for the COP26 in Glasgow in November, there is a lot that the Commonwealth can do. As Sir Ron indicated, the Commonwealth, going back to 1989, the heads agreed to one of the first collective statements to name greenhouse gases emissions as a leading problem facing the planet. And the Commonwealth has continued to be at the forefront of what needs to be done on climate change. I had the privilege of being at the 24th CHOGM in Malta in 2015, where the heads issued a leader statement on climate action. And the leaders called climate change, and as we know, an existential threat to many states, and called for then the COP21 to produce an ambitious, equitable, inclusive, rules-based and durable outcomes that includes the legally binding agreement that subsequently followed. And it was again towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, controlling climate change, tasks and opportunities that have gotten away from us somewhat, but we are still having opportunities to recover again, as Sir Ron pointed out, to the re-entry of the US into the Paris Agreement. But what some people may not be aware of is that significance of Commonwealth consensus building. At CHOGM in Malta, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he commented that in the lead up to the conference, the then President, US President Barack Obama, and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel urged him to make sure that the Commonwealth meeting and its climate talks would lead to real tangible outcomes and towards the global effort that was being undertaken. So people do recognize the Commonwealth's role outside of the Commonwealth, and we must continue to leverage it for our own collective benefit. I remember, and I am aware, as was said, coming from Barbados, from a small island developing state, that while climate change and the climate crisis affects every Commonwealth member state, every member state out there, it is particularly devastating to small island developing states and other vulnerable countries. Many of us are already dealing with increased temperature, sea level rise, storm surges, increased floods and hurricanes. But we have come a long way as SIDS in the last couple of decades. I recall when I was working at the Commonwealth Secretariat, the then Prime Minister of Barbados, Owen Arthur, leading the Commonwealth World Bank Joint Task Force on Small States that made the world aware of the vulnerability of small island developing states. We were proud as a Commonwealth to offer the world a vulnerability index to allow us to ascertain the classification for developing countries according to vulnerability. But regrettably, this is to still become a reality. And in the meantime, the nightmares of climate change and climatic vulnerability remain for us an everyday reality. For the majority of small states, of small island developing states, we look to the Commonwealth still to be a champion for us. It has, the Commonwealth, remarkable convening power, but the reality is for us as small states who sit around the table as equals, in theory, with our larger members, we hope and expect that the conditions and the concerns of SIDS will be taken up and championed by our larger members, our larger brothers and sisters. However, we are noting with increasing concern that the Commonwealth is seen more so or less so as an association of equals and more driven by the agenda of its larger members. But again, because a significant number of Commonwealth countries are SIDS, we hope to be able to continue to get the support of the collective body. I remember when I was in London in 2017, when Hurricane Irma and Maria tore through the Caribbean in quick succession, it caused immense devastation. We remember that Vanuatu was to host the 2018 CHOGM until it was devastated by a cyclone. The reality of climate change demands that resilience and building resilience be a priority for all Commonwealth members. For us in the Caribbean and small states, in the blink of an eye, small islands can be hurled from seeming prosperity to absolute poverty, lacking basic human needs such as water or food or clothing, shelter or sanitation. I recall in 2017, the petition, the plea by the Dominica Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit, following the passage of Hurricane Maria. He said, initial reports are of widespread devastation. We have lost all what money can buy and replace. He went on to say, my greatest fear for the morning is that we will wake to news of serious physical injury and possible deaths as a result of the hurricane. He underscored, we need help, my friends, and we need help of all kinds. And 4 years later, Dominica is still not fully recovered from the impacts of those hurricanes. And so where I am, based on the mainland in the United States, I am now in South Florida, where when we are threatened by hurricanes on the mainland, people can run for cover. And more importantly, there are pools of resources that can be mobilized after and dispatched to resolve the crises that hurricanes bring. That is not the reality of small island states. When hit by a hurricane, and especially a major hurricane, it feels almost like game over, that nothing is left but hardship and faith. So, as we prepare for the Commonwealth Summit in Kigali, we hope that it will give voice again to the vulnerability of small island developing states and become a central part of the Commonwealth's push towards COP26. And although there is amongst the Commonwealth a majority of small states, We are now driven, as I said before, more so by the agenda of our larger members. We are also, as a Commonwealth, constrained by the fact that our institutional structure is not as robust and as responsive as it has been in the past. We don't have mechanisms to influence members' behavior. We use moral suasion and peer pressure, but we have to make that work. Equally important is that we know that the Commonwealth Secretariat is not as strong as it used to be. There is need for greater transparency, clarity of mission, and serious uncertainties that plague it about its funding going forward. Nonetheless, we need to work together. And while no longer all the roads in the Commonwealth lead to London, there is the opportunity that this family of nations that is brought together by shared histories, shared languages, I would like to believe a shared destiny, can come together and work towards the security, the climatic security and stability of our members and the wider world. We know that this will take time and it requires more effort. Once upon a time, all of our members identified with the Commonwealth because it was the major vehicle for our development, for our diplomatic and global interface. But since the end of the Commonwealth trade preferences in the 70s, the regions have built greater capacity to do things amongst themselves. The Pacific, Asia, Africa, the Caribbean is closer together and working more collaboratively. But the Commonwealth still has the ability to harness the regional aspirations into one collective voice and offer to the world some consistency, some consensus around critical policy issues. But that, unfortunately, too often is not happening as the Commonwealth and the Commonwealth Secretariat tries to embark and amplify or offer voice without relating back to the regional needs, the regional realities, and the regional discussions and decision-making. But we can, and I believe, go forward together. And there are some things, speaking as a small island developing state, that the Commonwealth can advocate and champion, both in terms of climate change and small states, to reduce our vulnerability to make us more resilient going forward. The Commonwealth does speak about its climate change program, but it has to move from articulating this as a cross-cutting theme to ensure that resources are allocated to climate change and small states, and that the program area to support these needs is well-funded and robust. We need from all of our Commonwealth members, big and small, vulnerable and not, coordination in terms of developing resilience. Technical knowledge and expertise is needed to strengthen building codes in small states and the use of resilient design techniques to protect our communities when adverse weather systems strike. There is a need for preparedness. In the Caribbean, we have a wonderful model through the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, which offers a responsiveness to any Caribbean island that is threatened. This is a model that we can offer the Pacific. This is a model that could be complemented by greater resources coming in from our larger members. But we also believe that there's an opportunity for our larger members to be part of a first responders response mechanism, where in a crisis, when any kind of natural disaster hits a Commonwealth state, especially small vulnerable states, that there is a mechanism by which all members have already identified in advance what assistance can be given, whether in cash or kind, and that is mobilized in an instant and made available to the country affected. There is a need for stabilization, programs that allow, as Sir Ron mentioned, countries to recover both in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of financial assistance to make sure we can get back on our legs. That relates to issues of risk insurance, to see if the Commonwealth can develop a risk insurance and reassurance facility that allows the more vulnerable members to ensure that we can get adequate coverage and negotiate competitive premiums. But also, again, as mentioned, we need the support of our larger members to deal with the issue of development assistance. We need to change the OECD Development Assistance Committee rules to appreciate the unique vulnerability of SIDS and to ensure that we are not graduated out of accessing preferential loans, so that when disasters hit, they can assist us in responding to our devastation. I hope, as I'm sure many of you do, that the Commonwealth Secretariat in the lead up to CHOGM will work with the other agencies and the individual member states to add value to these much needed areas of intervention in terms of climate change and small states. I hope as well that the Commonwealth will look beyond its boundaries to coordinate an agenda with, like, the Alliance of Small Island States at the UN, the World Bank Small States Forum, and other relevant agencies to make sure that the needs of vulnerable and small island developing states are not lost amongst diverse and competing interests within the Commonwealth. I thank you for this opportunity to share with you and look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you all, and thank you, moderator.
Hewitt, thank you very much. You've given us also so much to think about. Common, I think, in both presentations so far is the efforts, the valiant efforts so often for short-term mitigation and survival of small islands. But it's the long-term guarantees, the overcoming the exposure to risk in investment, in planning, which is coming so clear. I now turn to, if I may, Gabrielle Swaby. Gabrielle, welcome. Gabrielle works with the long-established and highly respected International Institute for Environment and Development. She knows her way around the climate politics maze. I won't call it a jungle, but and she is supporting least developed countries with particular attention to mitigation and their nationally determined contributions. That's another acronym we've got to get used to, the NDC, Nationally Determined Contributions. That is, affects all countries, what they will do to cut greenhouse gases. And as we've been reminded by Sir Ronald, the smallest countries don't actually, frankly, have much to cut. And also to adapt to climate change, which is really important. Gabrielle was in Madrid for COP25 when this whole issue came up, when there was tension and pushback from several countries to demands for reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So Gabrielle, you've been there, seen there, and I'm sure you have a t-shirt, but tell us how we can, how from your Institute's standpoint, are we progressing towards COP26, and what is the impact the Commonwealth could make and is making, and your other observations? Over to you.
Thank you, David. And it's not a t-shirt, it's a reusable water bottle that I ended up getting from the conference.
Bravo.
Thank you very much for having me this evening. And it's quite intimidating being on the panel with such eloquent and wonderful speakers. But the benefit to speaking last is I can just say I agree with everything that you've said, and we can go on from there. So you'll find in my intervention that I really am repeating and really honing in on exactly the points that Sir Sanders and Reverend Hewitt mentioned. So thank you. Indeed, CHOGM this year is going to provide a unique opportunity to show that world leaders from these countries, rich and poor, big and small, are committed to addressing climate change with the urgency it deserves. And this will be particularly through commitments that increase climate ambition and protect the most vulnerable. It's an opportunity to influence and shape leaders' engagement before COP26 in Glasgow. And indeed, as we've heard, a hefty number of members in the Commonwealth are small island developing states or least developed countries. And the thing is, CHOGM, this platform, it creates a captive audience, both politically and through the media, for LDCs and SIDS to articulate their experiences as countries already living with significant climate impacts. These countries together have that critical opportunity and use that captive audience to make the case for an outcome at COP26 that responds to their needs and priorities, many of which have been well laid out by our fellow speakers. And that includes adapting to climate change, increasing climate finance, more capacity building and technology development and transfer, and efforts to address the losses and damages that climate impacts cause, all of which are needed for LDCs and SIDS to help manage future and current climate risks. CHOGM is that platform for LDCs and SIDS to demonstrate essentially what to them is going to be a fair agreement at the coming climate conference. So what experience can LDCs and SIDS bring to the table? Again, a lot of this has already been said, but really we also just need to look at 2020 to get a flavor of this. We remember last year, the Solomon Islands, who have not suffered one death from the COVID pandemic, all lost almost 30 lives to Cyclone Harold. In Bangladesh, we read headlines that almost a quarter of the country was flooded after monsoons left an indelible mark across South Asia. And the Caribbean, where I'm from as well, suffered from its worst hurricane season since records began. And a message that you've heard already, even though these countries have contributed the least to climate change because of their negligible emissions profile, they are suffering the most from its impacts. Some research that we did at the International Institute for Environment and Development shows that over the past 50 years, while only 18% of climate-related disasters happened in LDCs, 2/3 of worldwide deaths caused by climate disasters occurred in LDCs. So we're seeing that these countries are suffering a disproportionate burden from climate impacts. In recognizing how much of an existential threat climate change poses, LDCs and SIDS, we've heard, are doing more than their fair share to tackle the problem, even though the burden should not rest on them. Our hosts for CHOGM this year, Rwanda, for example, showed their climate leadership. They were the first African country and first LDC to submit their new nationally determined contribution this year. Jamaica, where I'm from, was the first SIDS, small island developing state, to submit this climate pledge. And essentially it's a country's statement saying how they're going to reduce emissions. And it's a document that they need to present every 5 years to show how they're upping the ante and upping their efforts every 5 years. And already Rwanda, Jamaica, and others are ahead of the league. But SIDS and LDCs need support to achieve many of their ambitious goals. And in and outside of the UN climate talks, we hear calls from them for support, for solidarity, from world leaders from the most developed countries. They're concerned about shrinking ODA. They're concerned about developed countries failing to meet their climate finance commitments. Sir Sanders mentioned the commitment for developed countries to provide $100 billion annually to support climate action, and we've yet to see that come forward. So considering all this, what message should LDCs and SIDS take to CHOGM, and how can that then link to COP26? I think of three things specifically. One, making the case for their needs and priorities. And this is in particular for better climate finance and debt relief packages, especially because of recovery efforts post-pandemic. The thing is, it's not just about the quantity of the finance, but the quality of the finance. Again, Sir Sanders mentioned that current systems are, it's a difficult task to access finance at the moment, hindered by red tape, transactional costs, burdensome reporting, and more. So it's important that systems are designed and reformed to be more streamlined and more accessible so that these countries who need that finance the most can access it. And even more, that finance needs to respond to their needs, where it's reaching the local levels and to vulnerable populations who need it most, instead of satisfying a donor's agenda. COVID-19 and post-pandemic recovery discussions will take center stage at CHOGM, no doubt. And whilst the Alliance in 2018 had committed to support measures that tackle effective debt management to alleviate unsustainable debt, a high-level dialogue on debt and post-COVID recovery financing is anticipated. So this meeting will require consideration of what building back better is and pursuing green and resilient recovery from the pandemic. The thing is, so far, resilience has been largely absent from a lot of the recovery discussions. A lot of the stimulus packages that we've seen from developed countries in response to the pandemic are more fueling the dirty sectors as opposed to the green sectors. And so this needs to change so that it can really support delivery mechanisms for climate and nature and better development. The second point is around raising the pressure. I believe it was, yes, Reverend Hewitt, who mentioned that there is inequality across the Commonwealth, but it can be something that can be leveraged. The thing is, the big emitters, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the UK, a lot of them are still not providing transparency to the international community by providing their updated climate pledges or long-term strategies for how they're going to reduce the emissions and really put policy backing behind a lot of their talk. And so having the strong and moral voice from LDCs and SIDS push and put pressure on these countries to come forward with their climate pledges and stronger climate pledges will be important. And with this push from the climate vulnerable countries, we can get a sneak peek of what Glasgow will mean to leaders from these major emitters. And the third point is around accountability, specifically around holding the UK to account, not just for delivering a successful COP26, because the UK holds the presidency for that conference, but also to the UK for calling itself a climate leader. Indeed, the UK is doing a lot and ambitiously so at home, but due to its historic emissions, which is something that cannot be forgotten, the UK cannot do its fair share within its own borders. Rather, the UK needs to also help displace emissions abroad. It can do this by investing in clean energy in Commonwealth countries, many of whom have huge untapped renewable energy potential. If Britain wants to be taken seriously as a climate leader that truly wants the Commonwealth to be modern and a thriving entity, then it should stop shirking responsibilities abroad and step up investment to those who desperately need it. And in so doing, the UK, who also holds presidency for the G7 this year, must bring climate change and climate action to the fore of its political agenda, not just at the G7, but at every single forum that it also attends this year, including the UN General Assembly, the G20, and so forth. So with raising the pressure, with accountability, and with making needs and priorities come full force, the LDCs and SIDS can collectively use their voice to really push for change within the Commonwealth and use that leverage of a diversity of members to push forward with consensus. My last takeaway before I pause is that the road to COP26 and the climate conference, it's not the end of the road once we reach November, nor is it the only stop. 2021 is filled with important international moments which can serve as drumbeats of momentum as we move towards seeing countries push forward ambitious climate action this year. I mentioned the G7 and the G20. The US is also holding its own climate leaders summit in April. And so making sure that these countries that are represented or speaking at the various summits are bringing climate action to the fore. We have a tall task ahead of us to change the status quo. And this will be super important over the coming decade. This will be the decade of delivery. And if the Commonwealth's or CHOGM's theme this year is delivering a common future, then it needs to start now and it needs to happen over the next decade. Now is the time to set the foundations for an agenda of reform, going for business unusual, if I may. And if COVID pandemic has taught us anything, it's this: when facing a crisis, early action, listening to the science, and a bit of behavioral change are necessary to overcome that crisis. And the way how we respond to climate change, I think, should follow suit. I'll pause there. Thank you very much. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you, Gabrielle. So I do want to open it out to the many questions which have been put forward, and Philip and I will be looking at these. But I just want to dwell for a moment on who the targets are. We know who our forces, if I say our forces, you know, the smaller countries within the Commonwealth. But we, the people who are looking at each other's faces at the moment in the UN Association and other campaigning organizations. We've spoken about the IMF, we've spoken about the United States, we've spoken about our own government and the G7 coming up. Is there a united message that we can hit, you use time and time and time again so people get used to it? Or are we in danger of, again, weakening our messages because we're not being united enough? Where is the real source of energy, Sir Ronald, first, that can drive this? I mentioned that John Kerry has returned to Washington in an executive capacity. Is there any démarche on smaller countries yet possible in Washington? And with the IMF there, I know the IMF argues it is now taking into the sorts of risk that Guy Hewitt was speaking about into its loans. Is there any evidence of that yet? What is the feeling that you feel in that respect?
Well, I think it's important for us all to recall that the IMF operates on the basis of what it's directed to do as a board of directors. And then when we look at the board of directors of the IMF and the World Bank, we see who those commands come from. So it's the G7 countries, basically, who run the IMF and the World Bank. They're the ones who lay down the policies. They're the ones who give the direction. The IMF is not a country, not an institution unto itself. It does take directions from governments. And therefore, you know, we talk about the IMF and the World Bank in kind of abstract terms, But I come back to, I make the point that they are the servants of the people who sit on their boards and the governments that they regard as the most important contributors to their existence. That boils us down again to the rich countries of the world. So targeting the IMF and the World Bank is, in my view, a pretty useless exercise. The people we have to be talking to are the people who run them. And we know who those people are. It comes back, you talk about unity, and I recall the point made by Reverend Hewitt that the Commonwealth is now being driven by its rich members, its more powerful members. Well, Guy, I have to tell you, in my experience, and I was there from 1983, that's always been the case. So it's nothing new. But how is it? How do we address that? How do we stop it? It does need unity. But I tell you what is the worst thing about the countries of the South, and that is that they have no unity. They are very easily picked off by other countries. I give you the example, for instance, it's one that every time I think about it, it troubles me. We once had an African, Caribbean, and Pacific group which negotiated jointly with the European Union on trade, aid, and investment. And then the French managed successfully to pick off the French African countries from being a part of a single voice of Africa. And then they picked them off from being a single voice of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states, all to serve French interests. The unity of the ACP was broken up on the altar of self-interest. And unfortunately, that happens all the time. Little countries are either induced or coerced by larger ones to their agenda, not to the agenda that is important to small countries, but to the agenda of the bigger ones. And until there is some unity of purpose amongst these countries, we're always going to find ourselves unable to break the barrier of their control. That includes the IMF and the World Bank. It includes their lending policies. It includes the criteria by which countries such as mine, and maybe Antigua is a good example. Let me just tell you let me just explain what I'm saying. Antigua is one of the high-income countries in the Caribbean, as incidentally is the country from which Guy comes, Barbados. Now, because we are high-income countries, allegedly, we cannot access concessional financing from the IMF and the World Bank, regardless of what happens to our countries. The worst kind of devastation. We still cannot access it because that is the criterion they use, high income. Now, why are we high income? We are high income because in the case of Barbados and in the case of Antigua, we are representative democracies. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in constitutionality. We have trade unions which advocate on behalf of their workers. And part of what trade unions do is they seek better terms and conditions and salaries for their workers. We can't dictate that pace. That is a matter of bargaining between trade unions and the private sector and between the trade unions and the government. But it is a facet of our democracy that happens. So in part, the fact that we have high incomes is a result of our democracy, of our open governance. But here's another point that I think everybody needs to bear in mind here on this particular point. Both Barbados and Antigua, countries of the Caribbean, are open economies. We welcome foreign investment. In fact, more than that, we go out and seek it. But it has a twist. When we invite people to come into our countries, large investors, they also pay their executives and the people they bring with them huge salaries. And those huge salaries distort the per capita income of the country. So in Antigua, for instance, we may have 10% of the people, mostly expatriate, earning huge money, but 90% of the people are not. Yet the criteria by which we are measured is high per capita income. If Bill Gates ever said he wanted to come to live in Antigua, I would refuse him entry. Because the day he landed in Antigua, our per capita income would be so high, we'd qualify for absolutely nothing on the basis of that criteria. It's the most ridiculous thing. Yet it continues to be there. And you have to ask yourself why. It can't be that the economists in the Treasury Department of the United Kingdom or the United States or Canada don't understand what I've just said to you. They understand it, yet they continue to implement it. It is, in my view, a method of control. But until countries, developing countries, start to stand up for each other, as in fact, if we go back a little further, over the fight for the struggle for Zimbabwe, of which I was a young man and part of that, and then for the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Why was the Commonwealth effective? The Commonwealth was effective because its developing member countries stood together, even at the time when the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher did not want to do so. What we prevailed. We prevailed because the numbers were on our side. And until developing countries lift their voices together and stick to it, they are never going to be able to change the system. Now, AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States that is working in the UN system and has done some very good work in the COP arrangements, is perhaps one of the few areas where we've seen that unity of purpose continue. In my view, not as strong as it should be, because they too have conceded when put under pressure and given promises by bigger countries, as happened in Paris in 2015, which is why we ended up not with commitments to deliver, but commitments to pledge. And a pledge is only that. It's not a delivery. So I will end there, but that's my response to that point.
Thank you very much. Well, Reverend Hewitt, this really does segue into something that you have been saying, and I read that you were advocating Barbados have stronger links to Africa, to Kenya, and to Ghana, I believe. Do you feel that these are the types of links, that notwithstanding what Sir Ronald has said, history taught us with the Anglo-French breakup, that the Commonwealth should explore different types of alliances within itself and not only be radially run, so to speak, from London or whatever?
Well, exactly that. The challenge with the Commonwealth is that it is a victim of its own history. It has a sense of these 54 countries that, well, largely have shared a historic relationship, have a common identity relatively, and work together. But the number is too large to try to do it as a single unit. And that is where I tried and sought to encourage the Commonwealth to really focus more regionally, to try to decentralize itself to the extent that it could work in tandem with regional organizations across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and therefore be a conduit for advocacy, be a conduit for consensus building, be a conduit for collaboration, as Ron said, with AOSIS, or whether it's the Small States World Bank, Small States Forum, or other like-minded agencies and institutions to get what the weaker and smaller members want to have achieved. The challenge is that in the Commonwealth Secretariat, you get an institution that is being pulled in two directions amongst its more influential, its richer members, and its smaller and more vulnerable members. And you would hope, or what needs to happen, is that we have to take a strong stance. You need a leadership that says we need to speak and work on behalf of the majority of the members and use the small moral suasion to bring the wealthier ones along with it. But we have seen over time that the resources being put into the Commonwealth has diminished. And as a consequence, the executive leadership of the organizations has tried to appeal to or appease the larger members by following their program dictates, but that has ultimately worked against the organization's effectiveness. And so for us going forward, we need strong leadership that speaks to the priorities of the majority. And in here, we are talking specifically about the agenda of small and vulnerable countries as regarding climate change.
So looking at some of the questions that have been put forward, Carl Wright, who many of you know, has brought up the point of what do we do in a post-COVID security situation? And can it be green-led? How do we avoid it being business as usual? Is there a different voice that small countries can tack onto this? Bearing in mind the observations that both Sir Ronald and Guy Hewitt have been saying. How do we make sure we don't go back to normal? How do we ensure that that statement includes different approach to the risk insurance, different approach to the debt recovery? These sorts of points. If I can ask you, Guy Hewitt, and then I'm going to ask, this is from Carl Wright, who you know, I guess.
Yes, and thank you for the question, Carl. It's good to be here with you. I don't think that we can go back to business as usual. I think the impact of COVID-19 has changed the world in such dramatic ways, including the way we are dialoguing around the Commonwealth via Zoom, that things are going to have to change for Caribbean economies, for those in the Pacific, those that are tourism based. We are now aware not only of our climatic vulnerabilities, but our vulnerability to economic shocks in a way that I don't think we really interrogated and addressed in the past. So going forward, we do have to have a new agenda. We now recognize that the biggest threat to our futures, it's not about necessarily nuclear weapons, but it's about microbes. And I think that opens agendas up for new discussions and new ways of engaging. I want to believe that it could be, the agenda going forward would be greener, and everyone suggests that it should be. But as Saran, as Gabrielle has spoken to, the reality is the larger countries are paying just lip service to it. So unless we get a mechanism that can drive, that can build the alliances and build the cooperation amongst smaller states, we are not going to be able to hold the feet of the more dominant countries in the world to the fire, even with moral suasion, to get the necessary changes we need. So yes, I want to be optimistic, but history has taught us that this is going to be an uphill battle, notwithstanding the commitment everybody makes to in articulating the importance of climate change.
There is an element here as to exactly how genuine the host country is. I don't know whether Nick Watts, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I'll do my best. Thank you, David. Now, it's been fascinating, especially Guy Hewitt's remarks just now about regional, the possible regionalization of the Commonwealth. That sounds very plausible. But I was wondering, with the recent permissions granted for further fossil fuel extraction in the North Sea by the UK government, and by the reduction of aid from 0.7% to 0.5%, whether that changes the credibility of the host nation, and if that is a vital component of a successful COP. I mean, reflecting on the Paris COP immediately, the achievement of the Paris Agreement immediately after Malta, is there an important contrast between France then and the UK now?
Ronald. Oh, he's muted. Okay. So if I can ask Gabrielle to answer that question, you've seen a lot of cynicism in the past at previous COPs. Can you hear me, Gabrielle?
Yes.
Over to you. Over to you.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Nicholas, for that question. You're very right, and it is an issue of credibility and an issue of trust. It's standing on multilateralism and trusting your international community to come to the table with the same intentions as your country does is an important part of the process. And it's difficult to toggle where the UK as COP presidency is expecting and asking fellow big emitters to come to the table with commitments to cut fossil fuel subsidies, to stop investing in coal plants and oil and gas overseas, when they themselves are proceeding along those same tracks. It is an element that erodes that trust, especially when trying to build up coalitions in the run-up to COP26 to then have consensus in creating a new agreement. I think someone else on the chat also mentioned about export credits as well, which is a big issue that I know certain parties in the UK are against and are trying to advocate towards. I think in this respect, getting more involvement and advocacy from the UK citizenry and the British people to speak towards this and to really hold their government to account will be just as important as international peer pressure coming back to the UK. And hearing from the youth of the UK, from subnational city councils and so forth, and really bringing this home for Parliament and for the government is going to be it's just as important as well, so that really there's an echo chamber of messaging going into the UK government, so that the message is received that this is not fit for purpose, and we can't see the two-faced approach to climate action in this way.
Ron Sanders.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a quick comment. In all of these considerations, I think practicality has got to be considered. There is a very strong nexus between politics and business, and between government and business people. Governments don't make decisions about the economy, investments, and what's not to be invested in a vacuum. They do so on the basis of what their business community is telling them. Business communities lobby. They lobby on a variety of things that they feel is important to them. The oil industry and gas industry has been one of the biggest lobbyists in the world. They continue to be so. And governments respond to them for various reasons. Some of them because they're political contributors to parties getting elected, for instance, in the United States. I don't know how many of you recall during the debates between Trump and Biden, when Biden made the critical error of saying that he would stop oil exploration and
always been the most reckless and the most.
I'm just waiting for that person to turn off their microphone.
In Russia, they've been responsible.
I think it's somebody, Mr. Malik. Okay. Yes, if you remember that that occasion when Biden said he would not allow fracking, and immediately lost the support of states where fracking was taking place. Now, the business has a relationship to politics and to governmental decision making. And we should not discount that for a minute. Now, in relation to the Caribbean, place I can speak for because that's where I come from. In Antigua and Barbuda, for instance, what would be the point of us going carbon neutral or even carbon or cutting out carbon altogether? We contribute nothing to greenhouse gas emissions. It is so minuscule, it doesn't matter. But I tell you why we have to stick with what we have now. For us to convert from using fossil fuels to going green would be such a huge capital investment. We don't have the money to do it. We would need to be funded for that to happen because we would have to rip up all our grids, every line that we have for delivering electricity and energy across the country, and replace it with something else. Now, that's not a cheap exercise. The further complication in the Caribbean is that we now have 3 countries in our CARICOM grouping that are now oil and gas producers. One of them with probably now the largest oil and gas reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia, and that is Guyana. Now, with those resources on our doorstep and the possibility that their continued supply to us could be cheaper than we are paying for it now. And already oil and gas supplies are cheaper than trying to build out solar and wind energy in our region. We're talking about an awful lot of money for small countries. So we have got to weigh the capital investment that it will require from the returns we will get and balance that against the urgent payments that we have to make just to keep the country going. Those are the choices we have. So, but in any event, us going green is the answer, because all of the 58 countries, small countries of the world, are only producing 1% of the greenhouse gas emissions. It's de minimis. The people who have to be going green are the big emitters: China, the United States, the European Union, India. That's where the focus has to be. I just thought I'd throw that in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Carl Wright to prepare, but I want to come back to Gabrielle just for a second. Following up your earlier point about the perceived image as what's happening in the UK. And we have appointed Anne-Marie Trevelyan, MP, as to be our UK International Champion on Adaptation and Resilience. It's a great title. And doubtless this is going to be part of the shop window program for the UK over the next few months. I see that she made a virtual visit to Nigeria a few days ago, and for its National Action Plan on Gender and Climate Change. What is the impact of gender in this issue, Gabrielle?
Glad that you brought that up. Very important indeed. Women and girls are often suffering a disproportionate burden from the impacts of climate change. For example, in the Gambia right now, a country which I support in my work, they are in the process of reprioritizing their national development plan in light of recovery from the pandemic. And in so doing, their analysis have shown women make up the dominant force of the informal economic sector in the country. And because of that informality, their data essentially is not recorded or taken into consideration as prominently when developing policies or making decisions. And so the role that women take traditionally in society are often overlooked or seen as insignificant towards economic data. And so that feeds into how they are essentially overlooked when it comes to making more, sorry, my words are being a bit jumbled here, but they're often overlooked when it comes to decision making, and that is included as well when looking at the resilience of responding to climate impacts as well. My team in IIED, we work as well to support gender considerations in the negotiations in the UN climate talks. And in so doing, it's to ensure that the peculiar circumstances that women and girls go through or suffer from are brought into consideration when developing climate response policy, disaster management policy, as well as how they feed a part of overall economic data in the UK. It's not my area of specialty per se. Other members in my team definitely work on that more, but very important that women and girls considerations are brought into policy making around climate response and disaster management.
Thanks a lot. The other actors in the civic society domain, Carl Wright, tell us about them.
Thanks, David, and nice to see a lot of familiar friends and faces on this call. Yeah, I mean, really just two things. One is very much agree with Sir Ron that we've got to focus on the big countries, which are the big emitters, you know, not the small island states who are very much the victims. And I was very pleased Gabrielle earlier made a brief mention to subnational government, because clearly the biggest carbon emissions take place in the big urban centers, the big cities. And the point I was making, I put it on the chat already, is that I was present at the CHOGM in Malta in 2015, when I think the main achievement of the Commonwealth was pushing the government of India to take a more positive line at Paris, which was a few weeks later. And I also attended the Paris summit. And then sure enough, you know, that pressure on India made a difference in reaching a agreement, because India, you know, with many coal mines and so on, was very reluctant to agree some of the original targets. Now, my feeling, I may be wrong, but my feeling is that Modi has shown very little interest in the Commonwealth in the last few years in CHOGMs, and I'm not sure that kind of pressure can be repeated. So the basic point I'm really making, and it's something that's happening already in many parts of the world, is that you've got to focus at the subnational level, you've got to focus at the city level, at the level of mayors. And when Trump made his wonderful speech about he was more interested in Pittsburgh than Paris, the mayor of Pittsburgh immediately replied that, well, as the mayor of Pittsburgh, he was actually very interested in Paris and was actually making sure that emissions in Pittsburgh were going to be going down and aiming for zero carbon. So the point I'm really making is, as well as focusing on the national level, a heck of a lot can be done at subnational level, where cities can make a huge difference in reducing carbon emissions and taking action in informing the local population about the kind of things that do make a difference, like better energy conservation in homes and all those measures which go beyond what authorities do, but what individuals can do as well. So I think we've got to look beyond just talking about the Commonwealth governments, although they have their role. I think bringing in civil society, bringing in non-state actors, bringing in also subnational government, which have competence in this area, is absolutely critical. Thanks.
So just before I move on to Guy Hewitt, Carl, do you think we in Britain are rather disorganized when it comes to the power of mayors, when it comes to climate, when it comes to nuclear proliferation, when it comes to SDGs, when it comes to culture? Where do we stand? You're one of these people who knows an awful lot about on local government worldwide. Where are we in the pecking order?
Way down, I'm afraid. I mean, the UK is still one of the most centralized governance structures in the world, including the Commonwealth. And I think one of the, as we've seen in COVID, you know, it's only belatedly people realize, well, it might be quite a nice idea to engage at the community level to do test and trace and to combat COVID. And the same applies to climate change. I mean, a lot can be done. One thing I'm involved in my own little local area, including with the United Nations Association in Kent in UK, is chairing a partnership which brings together local government, private sector, universities and indeed civil society in climate action, and looking how our district here, Canterbury, can reach zero carbon as soon as possible. So I think a lot can be done even in a very centralized system like the UK. And of course, we are now getting some of the metro mayors in bigger places like Manchester and Bristol and other places. But the UK, David, I'm afraid, is still way down the list compared to many countries in Africa and certainly in Europe in terms of its centralization. And therefore, I think is less able to deal with those kind of issues than those countries which have a more decentralized structure.
Just passing information before I move on, Carl and I were involved last year with the program to mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations in the UK. And we thought we were making quite good progress, although there were terrible headwinds, which I won't dwell on now. But then we had a breakthrough. We met the Association of Local Government, and we really felt we really got our message through. But of course, then came COVID and everything collapsed. So we've experienced it too. Guy Hewitt, you're next.
Thank you again, David. I want to pick up on this point about the Commonwealth associations. In my role, prior role as a governor of the Commonwealth Secretary, I struggled to try to get the Secretariat to recognize the utility, both in terms of its operations and its programming, of aligning itself with other Commonwealth associations, but also in terms of consensus building to see that utility. Unfortunately, despite being a family, we are still prone towards some one-upmanship. And so there's a way in which Commonwealth, the wider Commonwealth family of network is not leveraged when it comes towards compelling governments to commit themselves to what is necessary for the development of the majority, not just member states, but the people that reside in them. But again, about Gabrielle's point, just in the lead into this discussion, Philip advised about the work that they're going to be undertaking in guerrilla diplomacy. In the lead up to the 2018 Commonwealth Summit, the Caribbean was struggling with an issue with the UK government. And when we realized formal channels were failing or were blocked, we resorted to guerrilla diplomacy. We engaged people on the ground, the media, the citizenry. And that is what really brought about significant change, nothing towards resolution, but significant change on the Windrush scandal, simply because we got the timing right, we had a very effective strategy, and we took a bottoms-up approach, which traditional diplomacy does not always encourage or probably see utility for. So I would say to anyone who is trying to push an agenda, that the more that you can get wide cross-section of support, the more likely you're going to be successful. Yeah, that's it.
I had difficulty today, as I mentioned, it was a very short notice, reaching the new Commonwealth Special Envoy on Climate Change. It'll be good to have a roundup before we end from different people's views, what ought to be top of his agenda. So there is an opportunity to put your views out of the top of your head in the chat box, but shall I put you in the hot seat first, Gabrielle? What should we, the British people, demand that is at top of his to-do pile?
For me, I would say put on par the importance of adaptation and resilience, as well as on par with mitigations, reducing emissions. For too long, adaptation and resilience was always seen as the sideline, on the sidelines across the UN climate negotiations, but also in terms of the general space around climate change and the conversation around climate change. And in working with LDCs and SIDS, more and more it becomes so more pertinent for efforts towards reducing vulnerability, enhancing resilience, and adapting to climate impacts is just as important as reducing emissions. As Sir Sanders says, indeed, because these countries contribute a negligible amount to climate change, it's really the effects that they feel in terms of climate impacts, from slow onset disasters like sea level rise to more intense and more frequent storms and other disasters. And being able to put in place long-term mechanisms that can support increased adaptation and resilience in these countries, that's really where it's going to make the difference, and really where it will make a positive effect on people's lives and livelihoods in countries across not just LDCs and SIDS, but other developing countries as well.
That's the message from the coalface. So Ronald, what do we tell him?
This person we're talking about is the UK's Commonwealth climate change representative, not the Commonwealth's.
The Commonwealth. He is appointed by the
Okay.
Commonwealth. Yeah.
Okay, so it's the Commonwealth person we're talking about, not
Yes.
the UK.
Yes.
But first of all, I would say to that person, he has a job to do. And that job is to try to sell to all the Commonwealth countries the importance of, first of all, stopping greenhouse gas emissions completely. Now, that must be the objective. The time frame at which that can be achieved, of course, is extremely difficult. It's like how long is a piece of twine. But I have a very good friend called Michael Kirby from Australia, who told me once something I've learned to live with, that when we started the fight against apartheid, we didn't know where it would end. But we thought the first step was necessary, and therefore we took it. Now, any envoy who takes on this job has to understand his role is to sell the idea that climate change, the end of climate change begins with greenhouse gas emissions being cut. He has to sell that to everybody. But part of the people who he has to sell it to is the business community. Because business communities are the people who drive greenhouse gas emissions. Not governments, they don't have factories. They don't have agricultural production. They're not using pesticides and weedicides. It's a business community. Somehow they have to be convinced too of the need to go green. Governments have to put in place the framework, the legislative framework for these things to happen. But ultimately, the private sector has to be convinced of it. Then how do you convince people in the United States, for instance, not to drive a motor car? In fact, the romance of the United States citizens with their motor cars goes back from the time Henry Ford actually created one, and it's never stopped. Yet it is one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, and probably so too in Europe. But there's a job to be done. And that person cannot compromise on the task. And if the person is ever put in a position where he or she is forced to compromise, that's the time they should offer the resignation and say why. That'd be a very strong message to the world of who it is that stopped that person from carrying out the task they were given, which was to convince the Commonwealth community that climate change is a threat to us all, not just the future generations, but to us now. It is beginning to have a very serious effect. So that is what I would say on that matter. Thank you.
Well, I have to say that Reverend Hewitt, it's for you to finish, but I have to read out a little statement which puts an awful cynical slant on what Sir Ronald has just said. Former BlackRock chief Tariq Fancy, BlackRock handling trillions of dollars of bonds investments, says that environment, social and corporate governance funds, $1 trillion in his case, cause little impact on reducing the planet heating emissions, and Wall Street is, quote, greenwashing the economic system, unquote. That's rather disheartening, isn't it? So, Reverend, lift us up before we close with Philip.
That sounds like it will require other skills that I am not engaging today. But I want to end really picking up the honest question that Ron asked. We need to ask, who is this person working for? Is the Commonwealth envoy working on behalf of the majority of members of small or vulnerable states? Or is he or she going to toe the line of the larger, more influential members? So it's a very honest question that needs to be asked. What is this person tasked with? Just being, in a sense, form and suggesting that the Commonwealth is committed to this, or are they going to deliver something tangible? But if they are committed to something tangible for the majority, the form or the process is going to be as crucial as the content. And within this, there is a need for that person to be able to work closely with the regional and sub-regional organizations and institutions to try to build consensus. If they wait until the 54 members come together to try to do this, it's going to fail. The few attempts where the Commonwealth has been effective recently, especially in the area of trade, was where there was direct engagement with members and with regions and doing that consensus building from the bottom up. Regrettably, in a sense, the Commonwealth or the Secretariat is prone towards some of its history with a very top-down approach. So I would say that is what we need, someone who is connected with the members, working regionally, and really building a bottoms-up approach towards consensus building. I'll stop there.
Philip, back to you, sorry.
David, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for chairing so expertly, and thanks to everyone for the questions in chat. I mean, I noticed just on the issue of the climate change envoy, whose appointment was announced by Patricia Scotland in December. As Nick Watt pointed out in the chat, he's a former director of the Prince of Wales International Sustainability Unit. So hardly bottom up, I think. An interesting interesting to think about the politics behind that. Let's leave it at that. I think what I really wanted us to focus on here is what the Commonwealth can do. And I think that our three speakers have really honed in on that, because it's very, very easy to describe the problem, far more difficult to think about solutions, and even more difficult still to think about how the Commonwealth can do something. And I think our speakers have also have addressed those practical issues very effectively and put some serious challenges and markers. And when Gabrielle said that what for the Commonwealth is to put the UK as host of COP26 and as a supposed climate champion. Well, good luck with that. But then immediately, of course, I thought of Gar, extraordinary work, activists and journalists and fellow diplomats in putting the British government under intense pressure at the summit in 2018. And I thought, you know, if anyone can write the guide to how to do that, it's Guy. So we've had this fantastic mixture of kind of expertise, and a really impassioned opening address by Sir Ronald Sanders. The people in the Caribbean in particular, he said, had been radicalized over climate change and are not prepared to be, I think the phrase he used was silent observers at their funeral arrangements. That's a phrase to take away from this evening. And so that radicalism, that passion has got to be harnessed, and one hopes that somewhere or another the Commonwealth will do this. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you, Sir Ronald, Guy, Gabrielle, and David for a fantastic panel. Thank you all for joining us. We will continue, of course, monitoring this issue at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies as we go forward to the Commonwealth Summit this June and COP26 later in the year. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.